Welcome to Lead and Follow, a podcast that explores how great collaboration actually happens. I'm your host, Sharna Fabiano, author of the book Lead and Follow, The Dance of Inspired Teamwork. And I'm pleased to bring you the latest research, insights, and learning methods to help you work together better with the people around you. I help founders, solopreneurs, and new leaders become great at collaborating because I've seen how much more becomes possible when people integrate their ideas, perspectives, and strengths in a practical way. To learn more about coaching with me and for a one-time discount on your first session, go to sharnafabiano.com/coaching and enter the promo code podcast. The link is in the show notes. And now, here's the episode. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Basil Read. Basil is a retired U.S. Navy captain, consultant, and a professor of practice in Troy University's PhD in Global Leadership program. He has been involved with leadership and followership development in a wide range of organizations, including a fascinating initiative at the FDIC. I'm eager to ask him about his research on the followership role played by executive assistants with their leaders, and about his current work around responsible global followership and global citizenship. Basil, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
I know that some folks in our followership community might have heard about the FDIC project you were involved in many years ago, but it's such a valuable story with so many incredible lessons. I want to make sure everyone knows about it. So would you give us a little context for the work you did there?
Sure. I joined the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, commonly known as FDIC, as part of a culture change initiative. The FDIC is an independent agency of the federal government, meaning that it is not supported by taxpayer dollars. And most people know it for insuring deposits in banks, but it also examines banks for their safety and soundness. In 2007, the results of the annual government-wide employee survey, known as the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, placed FDIC as tied for second to bottom of best places to work in the federal government. As a result of that fairly startling finding, the then chairman, a woman by the name of Sheila Bair, decided to launch a culture change initiative. And part of that change was to hire an internal faculty that would work on improving leadership throughout the agency. Prior to hiring that faculty, leadership development was a privilege, if you will. So, if you did very well, maybe your boss would manage to get you a quota to go to some leadership development program. When our faculty was formed, the directive was leadership should be for everybody, so everybody should learn leadership. Well, as we got to think about that, and we said, well, yes, everybody has the capacity to be a leader, but everybody's also a follower. And so we decided that we would add followership to the curriculum. Interestingly, in 2008, when the Great Recession started, FDIC was very involved in that because in addition to examining banks and insuring deposits, the FDIC is also the receiver of failed banks. So they take over a bank once it's failed and either close it, sell it to somebody more profitable, or the FDIC runs it themselves for a while. The agency grew almost double in size, and yet the chairman kept her focus on culture change. So we continued to work with people in leadership development throughout the crisis.
That's quite a bold move, right, to initiate that culture change and then continue in the face of that kind of growth. I'm curious about what the training itself looked like. You mentioned this was notably for our podcast audience, not just a leadership development program, but also followership. But you are working with many levels in that organization. So could you give us a little insight on how that rolled out?
Sure. So what we decided was that if we were going to teach leadership at all levels, we were going to require every employee to take what we called a core course. So we had a course for brand new employees, we had a course for new team leaders, new supervisors, which are first line managers, if you will, managers, which are second line, and then executives. So those were all required courses. In addition, we had a large number of electives. We also had on-demand online training. We did a lot of consulting work, working with, for lack of a better term, dysfunctional teams and groups. And we had some other things like monthly newsletters, et cetera, on various topics to include followership.
That sounds incredibly comprehensive. Thank you. What sort of results were you able to track from this initiative?
The interesting thing is, as I said, that 2007, we got these terrible results. We developed the faculty. We launched our program in 2008. And at that point, it was teaching every supervisor and above in the agency how to develop trust. In 2009, we launched our full curriculum. In 2011, FDIC went from, again, tied second to the bottom, to the number one best place to work in the federal government.
Amazing. I feel like that is the mic drop moment of this story, right? Such a dramatic increase from the bottom to the top. And now I have to ask, of course, were you able to identify any aspects of this culture change that were specifically tied to the followership material?
When I did my article on this, the agency had two ratings that we could directly tie to followership. The first one in the FEV survey was around empowerment and decision making. And that went from a favorability rating somewhere in the low 60s to 83%. Now, inside that, it included things like employees being encouraged to share their ideas and their ability to influence decisions. So we can directly tie that to followership. The second one was leadership overall. And inside that, there were some interesting questions around effective communication, employees feeling that they were being listened to, motivation, and whether or not they saw the leaders as being honest and having integrity. And that went up from somewhere in the 60s to an astounding 91% favorability rating.
You know, it strikes me that part of what your leadership development training did was to enable leaders to connect with followers better. And that connection seems to have made a huge difference.
I think it's pretty impressive of how we came. We stayed at that upper level for about 4 or 5 years as number one, and then stayed in the top 3 for many years thereafter.
What else can you tell us about the curriculum itself for listeners who might be thinking about making their own programs?
So let me talk a little bit about each of those courses, those core courses, and what they happen. In the introduction to FDIC, it was designed for new employees who had somewhere between a few months to a year within the agency. And that year seems like a long time, but that's because some of our new employees were new bank examiners and they had a very structured curriculum they had to go through. So as soon as they completed all that initial training, which just happened to be 1 year, they immediately came into our program. We would bring in 45 to 60 students at a time, and there were 4 topics that we taught. We taught trust building, we taught effective communication, we taught values-based leadership, and we taught followership. In the mornings, my faculty would teach those topics, and in the afternoons, they would do breakout sessions with facilitators. So they'd have about 12 to 15 people in each breakout where they would take a deeper dive into it. By the end of the week, they had to develop a briefing, each small group, on one of the 4 topics. Of course, followership was always one of the 4 topics. And they had to brief their topics to a panel of executive. And in that, they had to explain what they learned about the topic, how that topic interrelated with the other topics, and by embracing that topic, how that would change the agency. At the end of the briefing, the executives got to ask them questions, and the students got to ask the executives questions. So a very, very interactive program. Now, there was a subtle thing in there. As you can imagine, you don't get executives very long in any leadership course. So we actually were using these young, brand new people in the agency to teach executives about these 4 core components.
That presentation to executives is very clever and it's very strategic. I want to underline that for listeners because it's such an excellent example of structurally embodying a temporary role reversal in a way that's safe and not threatening, and that truly serves everyone. Brilliant.
In the team leader course, it's a week-long course, and it's very interesting, particularly when you look at it from a follower perspective. Most of the team leaders in the FDIC are examiners, and when they go to do a bank exam, one examiner is appointed as the examiner in charge. So let's say that you're the examiner in charge, Shauna. You go out to a bank, you spend 1 to several weeks there, depending on the size of the bank. You have your team, you put together a report. Let's say you did that in August. Now it's October, and it's time for your supervisor to send out a new team. Well, any commissioned examiner can be the team leader. So on the October team, you're a team member now instead of the team leader. And perhaps one of the people that was on your team is now your team leader. So now you're moving back and forth throughout the year of being in a formal leadership position and then moving back to the followership position. So it's a constant give and take. That makes a very interesting dynamic in which to discuss followership. We then moved on to the new supervisor course. That was our longest course. It was actually 32 weeks. Started out with 6 weeks worth of pre-reads and some things like 360 assessments, et cetera. They came into the classroom for a week where we were talking about this new dynamic of leading a group, but also still following. And the central part of this was, how do you convey what's coming down from on high, even if you disagree with it, in a way that your people will buy into it? We taught for a week. They went away for several months. They had more readings to do. They had some group projects that they worked on while back in their home offices. And then they came back together for a final week. The new manager course was very interesting because there we were really talking about leading up. These are the subject matter experts, if you will, that the executives most rely on. So how, in your follower role, can you influence the executives towards a decision that is beneficial both to the executive and to the agency? And then finally, in the new executive position, that was really a one-on-one. So the training was mainly one-on-one, maybe one full day with one of my faculty members, and then some assessments and an hour here, an hour there. But they really got that followership from being in the new employee course, getting those briefings and having to ask and answer questions.
I really love how strategic each of those programs were kind of mapped directly to what that group of people or that position in the organization would need to be doing, right? Whether they were rotating a team or whether they're in an executive role or a different role. I think there's a lot to learn there about just customizing both the leadership and followership training, right, for the work that's being done. Thank you for that. I know that you drew on Irish Hayliff's Courageous Follower material for this project. Could you speak a little bit about that, what you think made it work well for the FDIC case in particular?
I think that perhaps the point that resonates the most was the partner piece of it. And the reason that resonates so well is that FDIC is probably about 90% of the employees are college educated. And so they want to have an input into the overall organization, and they're looking at this as a long-term career. FDIC has very little turnover. Most people stay there for from their initial job until they retire. So you're looking at a long career. They're very invested in the agency. They're very invested in what they do. They can really see how they are protecting the financial health of the organization. If we had time, I would talk about how FDIC is the unsung hero of the financial crisis. It was actually the FDIC that stopped the bleeding from being worse than it was. And left us at a recession instead of a depression. But perhaps that's for another podcast.
Perhaps, yes. I'll just note for listeners, the model, Ira Chalif's model Basil's referring to is the leader and the follower revolving around the purpose of the organization as partners. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes.
When we displayed that model, we would have it there, and you could see leader and follower orbiting this circle that had the word in bold purpose. And at some point during our discussions, we would change that middle from purpose to FDIC mission, because that was our purpose in the organization.
Yeah, nice.
The other two things that resonated very well, and we spent more time on them than perhaps anything else, was the courage to support and the courage to challenge. And those also resonated well because we talked about how to challenge in a non-confrontational manner. And we worked very hard with our communications training, which was embedded in all of our courses, on how did you do that? How did you give constructive feedback in a way that was likely to be accepted?
So important. So important. Well, I could talk about Courageous Follower all day, but I want to ask you a few other questions. Can we move on to your research? You studied executive assistants and how, as followers in their followership role, they influenced their leaders. I'm curious what interested you in this particular population.
So when I was doing my doctoral studies, I was convinced that I was going to do a dissertation on high-performance teams. And about a year into my program, we had what they called an immersion weekend where we all came to campus, and Melissa Karsten showed up and started talking about followership. Now, I was already teaching followership at the FDIC, but she inspired me to change my thinking and look at followership as a dissertation topic. I was interested in looking at individual followers and whether or not those who were not in an advisory role or a subject matter expert role could influence organizational outcomes. Now, as you mentioned, in my previous life, I was a Navy officer, and at one point I was secretary to a 3-star admiral. And that's very similar to being an executive assistant. And we all know that executive assistants are sometimes referred to as the gatekeepers. They're the ones who determine when you get access to the executive. They determine what the executive sees and when he or she sees it. So I thought, based on my own personal experience, that executive assistants likely could be that person who could influence an organizational outcome. Interestingly, in looking at that, I found that there had been no studies done on executive assistants ever.
Wow.
Which is amazing because there are lots and lots of studies on the C-suite, but there's no studies on executive assistants. And to my knowledge, there's only one or two since I did my dissertation.
Oh my goodness. Listeners, if you're researchers out there, get on this topic. There is so much to discover about this relationship. I think it's absolutely fascinating. So, of course, I'm going to ask you if you would be willing to share some examples of influence that you found.
So it turned out, and another long story that I won't go into, but I wound up in the fashion industry. Is where I did this. And what I was doing was I was interviewing executives and their assistants separately to try to understand what that relationship was and what the power of the assistant was. All of them were sounding boards for their executives, without exception. As I thought, being gatekeepers, they determined who had access when. They went far beyond what I thought they did in terms of information. They screened emails, determining which emails the executives saw. Many of them just answered the emails on their own based on their relationship with the executive. They oftentimes took lengthy documents and condensed it down into a one-page memo. And again, it wasn't unusual for them to make a recommendation on what to do. Two of the things I think are most notable. One was the executive assistant to the president of a sports apparel company, fairly well-known, fairly large one based in the United States. The company was offered the opportunity to be the sole apparel sponsor for a major athletic event. And the executive assistant was tasked to write a memorandum for the board with the pros and cons. If you read the memorandum, the pros were way out there, very much about why they should do this, and the cons were kind of weakly written, but they were there. And then the bottom line on the memo said, if we don't jump on this, our competitors will. Guess what the board did? Is that influence? I think so. Created an organizational outcome. A more subtle example was a apparel company that owns, I don't know, 12, 14 major brands. You likely have at least one, if not more, of their brands in your closet. And they had a unique corporate social responsibility program where they not only gave funding to certain charitable organizations, but they also allowed their workers so many hours of paid time off each week to go and actually volunteer at those various organizations. Well, the company decided to expand a little bit and to look at some other organizations that they could support. And the executive assistant was tasked with creating a PowerPoint presentation, again, with the pros and cons of the various organizations and which ones they should support. And if you read the language within the PowerPoint, it was very subtle, but through analysis, it was very obvious which ones the executive assistant thought they should go with, and those are the ones that they went with. And those are just two examples. I think the most interesting thing that came out of this, though, was the power of the relationship. I had one executive tell me that her executive assistant could hack her life. The executive assistant had access to all of her credit cards. She had to move at one time. The executive assistant essentially found the apartment, furnished it, and she just moved in. Those types of things. But what came out of that was it was a very trusting relationship. The other thing that was interesting was that I looked at it through the lens of Karsten's passive, active, and proactive followers. Almost all of them were proactive followers. There were a few active followers, and the difference there is proactive followers take initiative without being asked. Active followers will wait to be asked, or they will ask, do you want me to do this? And of course, passive followers just wait to be told. So almost all were proactive. There were a couple of actives in there.
Super interesting. Yeah, I can see how this territory is very rich for more exploration. Yeah, thank you for sharing those. I imagine a lot of our listeners out there, or folks who coach others or do trainings themselves, work with people who are working closely with leaders, even if they don't call themselves executive assistants, right? There are a lot of these kinds of partnerships out there at different levels in organizations. So I'm wondering if this research you did offers any takeaways for more broad application.
I think it does. In some cases, chiefs of staff often act the same way as an executive assistant does. There are other people who, are called different titles but do the same type of thing. The gatekeeping piece is very interesting. Gatekeeping itself came from Lewin back in 1940s when he was studying the homemaker, which he called the gatekeeper, and how she determined how food got to the table.
Interesting.
But one of his students, a guy by the name of David White, looked at stories coming over the news wires in newspapers and how the editor would pick and choose which ones to put into the paper. And for many, many years, gatekeeping was closely associated with news media, and then it broke out into a bunch of areas. I think that there are lots of people who are gatekeepers. Sometimes they're gatekeepers because they have certain knowledge, sometimes because they have certain connections, or more in the tradition of the executive assistant who's deciding on access.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good thing to reflect on. Where are each of us gatekeeping something, right? I imagine it's a function that turns up more than we might think, even if not officially.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I also took note of your example on just phrasing language, right, in a pro con list or in a presentation, of any kind, potentially. The way that we use language is so influential, right? If we're presenting to anyone else, it sounds very general, but I don't know, tell me if you disagree. I feel like that's something we can all look at and think, how are we influencing others with the way that we emphasize something or de-emphasize something else?
Absolutely, and I'm going to tell a little story when we get close to the end that I think will emphasize that point fairly dramatically.
Okay, great. Well, I can't wait till we get there. In the meantime, let me make sure I cover all my bases here. Right now, you're working on something else very exciting, the idea of responsible global followership. So, could you tell us a little bit about what that term means to you as a researcher?
Okay, let me start by telling you how I came to this. At my university, I'm a dissertation chair. One of my candidates completed a dissertation on responsible leadership, which is kind of an emerging concept within the leadership community. And then I have two dissertations that are ongoing right now, and both of them are looking at global citizenship from different angles. And as I thought about it, I said, well, oftentimes when we look at something from a followership perspective, we look at how it's framed in leadership and we just flip the lens. And I didn't want to do that. I thought that responsible followership was something more. Responsible leadership is closely tied to corporate social responsibility and the tenets of that, along with a heavy emphasis on ethical considerations. But we see followers in a lot of different settings outside of the business world. So I really wanted to look at something more. And global citizenship, which comes out of the old term cosmopolitanism, has some of that in there. It's seeing yourself as being a stakeholder in the world, not just simply in your own country. And something that goes along with that is a global mindset. And global mindset is really about seeing and understanding that, there are different perspectives in the world, there are different cultures, et cetera, and embracing all of that. So that got me to think about, okay, what does the responsible global follower look like? And yes, the responsible global follower is going to be responsible in that leader follower dynamic. But there are a lot of things that you would think of that either don't seem to have a leader or that the follower is not directly associated with the leader. And I think that there are causes, there are ideas, there are movements. In the U.S., we've had three recent movements I can think of: the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the No Kings movement. Now, all of those have gotten some prominent people to be spokesperson, but they aren't really the leaders. And there might be a local organizer of an event, but they aren't really the leader. So what are you doing? You're following a movement. When you recycle, why do you recycle? You recycle because you are following a movement around something around saving the planet, right? And so I think there's a lot of things that we follow that have nothing to do with the leader. And so I see responsible global followership as both having that leader follower component, but also having other things in which we engage. And because we are engaged in it, we are therefore following. And so I'm looking at it in this broad context.
Yeah, that's fascinating to think of an idea or a movement being like filling the leader function in a way, which to me makes actually the following role more important because then you're more actively doing it, right? Choosing it.
Exactly.
Thinking about foregrounding followership in terms of global action, what are you noticing that looks like in practice, maybe in some of these movements you've mentioned or otherwise?
There are some prominent activists on the world stage that we could point to, like Greta Thunberg or Malala Yousafzai. I think that's how she pronounces her last name. But they tend to be largely focused on a single global issue. I'm more interested in everyday people. A recent survey found that 60% of Americans have an active interest in world affairs, and roughly the same percent are concerned about climate change. And further, three-quarters of Americans contribute to some sort of cause, be that Girl Scout cookies or perhaps a political election, and anything else in between. There are similar statistics in many other countries. This suggests that a significant portion of the population possesses these characteristics and has an interest in becoming more engaged in various facets. However, this is still in a conceptual phase. So I think that first we have to refine the concept, and then we have to see, okay, if this is a valid concept, what sort of training or initiatives do we need to do to help people better understand and grow within it?
Okay, at the risk of putting you on the spot, I'm intrigued by this concept, and I imagine many listeners are as well. The idea that my decision to follow something, a movement, a cause of intrinsic value, does not in fact require a leader. How would you advise me and listeners like me to further explore this in our own lives? What can I do today, or what can I ask myself to get started as a responsible global follower?
So I think awareness is the beginning step. And I think the starting place is being well read and well informed. All too often, there are people who rely on a single source or like sources of information, and therefore they're getting one side of the story, and they're getting the biases that come out of that provider or set of providers. Many years ago, when I was an undergraduate, one of my courses we were studying the Cuban Revolution. And the professor had us read accounts both in the US media and in the French media. And I will always remember this one example. Shortly after Castro came to power, the US media was saying, "Isn't it terrible? After the Cuban Revolution and Castro came to power, people have to stand in long lines where they're rationed 6 ounces of meat per person 3 times a week." The French literature said, "Isn't it wonderful? Prior to Castro and the Cuban Revolution, 80% of the population did not have meat in their diet. Now they get it 3 times a week." Same set of statistics, completely different outlooks on which way it goes. By reading both of those, you have a more holistic understanding of the issue than you would have if you had just read the American or the French accounts.
Yeah, absolutely. And then this must be that story you were mentioning earlier. Yeah, really powerful.
Yes.
When I hear those two stories, Basil, I just not only do I feel like I have a more holistic understanding, but I also feel more empowered to kind of make my own interpretation, right? Because it's not just the one sole source, as you're mentioning.
Exactly. I think that all too often now we are just accepting whatever we are seeing or reading without putting a whole lot of thought in it. I'm spending a lot of time, surprisingly, with doctoral students on critical thinking and building critical thinking nowadays because it's something that is not being taught. And again, this little vignette I just gave you is a perfect example of how you could quickly be led down a path because you're accepting a certain perspective or a certain lens without seeing it through multiple lenses.
Yeah, it was a perfect example. I'm going to ask this question without it being fully formed. We'll see how it comes out, but I'm just kind of simmering here on your idea of global followership, not having, one human leader, but having an inspiration almost, right? That anyone can follow, get interested in, read about, get involved with in their own way. What do you think makes followership of that kind notably importantly different than like the kind that maybe has been studied before between human beings, like in a team or in an organization?
I think that those types of things have intrinsic value to the individual. I mean, if you're recycling, it's because you believe that it's important. It's not because you're following some leader who says you must recycle. You're doing it of your own volition, and you're doing it because you believe that in that small way you are helping to make the planet a better place not just for yourself or your family, but for others around you. And I see the same thing in those movements I talked about earlier. People are invested in those movements because they believe that their voice has meaning and they believe that they can make a change. So I think that those things that you do in sort of this global level are intrinsic. And the thing with responsible global followership is that you can't be engaged in everything. You simply don't have the time. So you're picking and choosing, and that's okay. That's okay for you to pick and choose because, again, the more motivated you are towards something, the more you're going to invest time, energy, and resources into.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you for that note. That feels really significant. And now again, I'm going to ask another question that may seem really silly, but I'm thinking again of those times when I've decided, right, here's one thing I really care about. I'm going to find out about it and do something. And sometimes I end up leading other people to do something around that too. So it's almost like that intrinsic followership impulse, like to kind of go towards something, then sometimes puts you in a position where other people want you to lead them, or you find yourself in a micro leadership role doing some specific task. Does that resonate for you at all?
Absolutely. It's only natural that, if you are passionate about something, that you want others to become involved in it. And so you're going to try to get people to join you in the initiative. And sometimes they will see you as the leader. I had somebody describing leadership once and said, well, if you're in a group and everybody's trying to decide where to go for dinner and they default to you, then you're the leader in that moment. Simplistic, but yeah. But I think it's only natural, and it depends again on what you want to do and how involved you want to be.
Yeah, it just sort of underscores how functional and natural, as you mentioned, those relationships are when people kind of come together around a common purpose or a common interest, and they arise, as needed. Is there anything else kind of top of mind or anything you're curious about that you'd like to leave listeners with?
So there's one thing, and you may have heard me talk about this before, but it's kind of my whole thing about followership. When we first started to teach followership at the FDIC, we often had pushback because throughout their lives, people have been taught be a leader, not a follower. So one day, I looked up the dictionary definition of the word follow. And there are 18 definitions of the word, at least in the dictionary I was looking at. The first three were come after, move behind, accept the guidance of a leader. And those definitions continued along until I got to number 11, which read to engage or to be concerned with. So if the word follow can have engage as a meaning, then followership can mean engagement. So in terms of the leader-follower paradigm, I see followership as engaging with the leader in a way that produces the best possible outcome. In responsible global followership, I see it as engaging with leaders and with the world around us. Again, trying to come up with the best possible outcome. It's a choice whether you engage or you don't engage. It's also a choice in how you engage.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Basil, for sharing all of your wide-ranging insight and experience with us. Listeners, please join us at the upcoming Global Followership Conference at Indiana Wesleyan University, July 7 to 9, 2026, where Basil will be presenting his work alongside many other fascinating followership sessions. Register for the conference at www.globalfollowership.com. Basil, thank you again, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Sharon. I enjoyed being here.
You have been listening to the Lead and Follow podcast. Special thanks to Glover Gill for composing our music, and a huge thank you to all of you who support the show. It really means a lot. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or consider joining the Lead and Follow fan club for as little as $3 a month. There's a link at the bottom of the show notes.